Hey guys, welcome back to Serial at Midnight. I want to set up the interview that you are about to experience. This is the return of Guido Henkel from Celluloid Dreams with the co-founder of Celluloid Dreams, Lucas Henkel. They are a father and son duo who have launched this label. Now, Guido was here about a year ago to talk about the very first release from Celluloid Dreams, but now we have a short night of Glass Dolls. It's in a 4 disc. I've already covered this on my channel. Maybe you saw it in my most recent new release spotlight. But in a 4 disc mega presentation with a 4K, with the Blu-ray, with the VHS version, with a Grindhouse version, these huge lobby cards, tons and tons of features. I mean, hours upon hours of features. But we're giving a window into this new company 1 year in now and what things look like, what goes into the restoration process, because they are doing these restorations themselves. It is a two-man team doing all of this, taking these film elements and restoring them in 4K. So what does that look like? What does that entail? I think it's a really sort of riveting account of how film restoration works at this level, because it's different from a studio level or a lab or something like that. This is a very hands-on, small operation, and getting the insight into how this stuff is achieved is fascinating. So I want to thank Guido and Lucas Henkel for their time with me, and I think you're going to get a real kick out of this. Without further ado, the return of Celluloid Dreams. Guido, before we hit record, we were talking a little bit about commentaries, and you were talking about like what goes into the commentaries and how you spend so much time with these movies. And your commentaries are incredible. I know that we talked a little bit about this in our previous interview, but you are in your commentary for Short Night of Glass Dolls, right? You start by talking, don't you correct the director? Don't you say,
Yeah,
yes, yeah,
yeah,
tell the story.
yeah. That was a funny thing because we have a commentary with Aldo Lado on the disc, and right in the beginning, when the film opens in that park scene when the body is discovered, he mentioned that this was shot in Prague, in a park in Prague. And I'm looking at this as like, this is not Prague. So I started looking into more detail what that park looks like and all that. And eventually I found out, yes, this is actually a park in Zagreb. And with the help of Google Maps and all that, the magic of Google Maps these days, I was able to really go down on that microscopic level and double check and make sure, is this what I'm looking at in the movie? And yeah, lo and behold, it is that park, and there's a building, there's a statue and everything. And that was kind of interesting and all. But at the same time, I can't blame Aldo for any of that because, I mean, it's been so long that he made the movie when the commentary track was recorded with him. So I'm pretty sure there's a lot of stuff that is being forgotten and just blurred.
I mean, I can't remember certain details from last week, let alone 50,
Tell me about it.
yeah, 1970, was it 1971, right?
91, yeah.
Lucas, this is your first time here. I got to spend like an hour with Guido the last time he was here. Welcome to Serial at Midnight. I'm glad to get to talk to you.
I'm glad to be able to talk to you too here.
How did you, so you guys created this together, right? And I've heard Guido talk about it, but I want to get your perspective on where the birth of Celluloid Dreams really began.
So, in a way, it started with, in general, just the inherent love for movies, for film, and whatnot. I've grown up over the many years watching plenty of old movies or so. It's just sort of been ingrained in my head for since also in the high school days. I remember watching a lot of very specific boutique label movies. So I was like very into Fulci, very into Argento around then. And that was when I was becoming more aware of companies like Synapse and Blue Underground, Arrow, and whatnot. And it was a fascinating thing to see from from a third party perspective, especially since at the time on every now and then I would do an occasional review thing on DVD review. But it was like then eventually when I got into college and I started, although my academia was in software engineering, my on the side I like to work in movie stuff when I could, even though it was just with other students at the time. But it also got me into color grading because I was very much into color grading film, and I was also very heavily interested in what gives films theatrically in the 80s and 90s and whatnot their look, because I've seen a handful of projections around then for movies like The Beyond and Army of Darkness and whatnot, and they stuck with me over the years for being very different experiences than what I grew up seeing with the Blu-rays or DVD or whatnot. And it was the kind of thing that I always wanted to understand more. And eventually, yeah, where it's like when it came time for me to, was like, once I graduated, wanted to find a job. I originally tried to get a job as a colorist, kind of struck out. And then eventually a train of thought did lead into the question of what are the requirements, the difficulties of having one of those companies to begin with. Because with some of those labels out there, you can see they're like really tiny in the grand scheme of things. You know, I mean, if you like, DOLLS was just, it's him and
Synapse. I mean, companies like Blue Underground and Synapse and all that. You know, these are really small boutique labels, 2, 3 people and all doing all that. A lot of it is farmed out, which is what we try to avoid for most of it. Although we can't avoid it altogether, but we try to do most of it in-house. But still, you know, the question really came up. It's like, what does it take to start up a label? And, you know, what are the logistics of it? And what is the money that is involved in this and all that? So, yeah, we researched it, and now you know, this is what happened.
Yeah, I'm curious too. It was a physical media house because of the website, because of the DVD review, and because of the analytical look at these things. Lucas, I'm kind of curious. You're of the digital era, right? I mean, physical media is not really a thing that people under a certain age generally collect. I'm kind of curious what your experience was with that. You know, if you had to come to it, or if it was just always there and you were born with, you know, by having it around, it was a part of you.
it's both in the sense where, yeah, as I grew up, if I had to describe, you know, what it looked like growing up or so in the house, imagine every wall had a giant shelf full of discs. It's like you could pretty much almost every, yeah, like the,
Kind
where
of like,
every
yeah, yeah.
movie that you normally could conceive of, you know, there was a copy of it around. And then I would kind of say around the later 2000s is when that started becoming a bit more iffy, because that's, you know, when, yeah, physical media started weaning off and the streaming platforms came in. And at first, streaming platforms were great. You know, there was like Amazon Prime had practically everything, and Netflix.
Hmm.
But then eventually we've hit that point where you have Paramount Plus, HBO Max, Disney Plus. Like everyone has their own platform. Half the platforms don't even have the movie that you're looking for. And then it kind of ends up, it was like, okay, I have 3, 4 different subscriptions. None of them have it. Guess I'm going to Tubi because I don't know where the disc is for this. And that's kind of what it ended up being. And then you sit down and watch Tubi, and then you watch an anamorphic movie suddenly being cropped to 16 by 9,
Yeah.
which just
Well, then a
goes
90-minute
my
movie
head to the
becomes
desk.
like 2 hours and 15 minutes or something like
Yeah,
that
Yeah.
too.
I mean, we had so many conversations where he would come up to me and like, have you ever heard of this movie? It's like, yeah, there's got to be a DVD somewhere. It's
in
like,
in a box
yeah, it's
somewhere.
like, I would like to watch this movie. It's like, yeah, there's a Blu-ray on that shelf. You know, it was always like that. But he went through a real phase, I have to say, where he was obsessed with 35 millimeter presentations. And because we were in California, you know, there were quite a few opportunities to do that, because you know, you have these art house theaters, and then up in LA there are screenings and everything. And you know, at least once a week or so he would come to me and say, oh, can we go to LA, they're screening, you know, Army of Darkness, or can we go here, there's John Carpenter showing this and that. And I was like, you know, almost like a taxi service.
Yeah, but I'll tell you what, there is nothing like that film culture in
It's
Los
it's
Angeles. And you can
insane.
see it with some of the people that made it or, you know, were in it, which is amazing.
It's a very different experience, yeah.
Yeah.
And that's, you know,
Yeah.
what we try to recreate with our releases, really. Instead of trying to create these super, I don't know what the right word would be, these really modern, slick looking presentations of the film. we are much more concerned with trying to recreate that vintage, this original vintage look that they used to have.
Well, you keep a very filmic presentation for these movies, and you've gotten praise for the restorations, and it's deserved because they look you haven't overly cleaned them. I mean, you've taken out, as we can see in the various bonus features, you can see what's been taken out, what's been cleaned, but you've left this really filmic. There's a lot of grain in a good way, grain in a good way. And I commend you on that because I think that is what cinephiles want. They want to see what the movie, quote, should look like.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, the grain in particular, we've had many conversations, should we take the grain out? Should we leave it in and all that? And that happened during Bloody Iris already, that we had a lot of conversations because you have these cool software tools, and you turn them on and suddenly you can adjust the grain level and you look at it, it's like, wow, this is absolutely amazing. You can have this picture without any grain. But then you look at it again, it's like, yeah, but this doesn't look like the movie looks like, it looks like plastic, it looks like this, and it's like, this is anything but. So early on, then we decided, no, we're not applying any noise reduction at all. And instead, what we're really going heavy on is the encoding instead. If you take a look, for example, at the 4K Ultra HD, we're literally maxing out the bitrate for that platform. The same with the Blu-ray. We had to re-encode the Blu-ray version because it had such a high bit rate that some players choked on it. I was like, okay, this is a little too much. We got to pull back a little. But, we're really trying to go as high as we can without, like I say, making players choke and all that. And especially in Short Night, that was perfect because we didn't have bonus features on the disc, aside from those 3 trailers. So we could take the entire disk space really and play with it and make sure we get the best encoding possible. And I think it really pays off.
It pays off. It's beautiful. Lucas, what were you going to say?
Well, you pretty much already summed up what I was going to say, where it's like it's definitely became more tied with encoding, because I remember one of the earliest concerns we had was whether or not it would be an issue for the grain to be strongly present because of encoding. And that's why I know for some masters out there, DNR is used to some degree in order to help compression work properly, so it doesn't look like totally crunchy, like a crunchy mess. So we were incredibly happy knowing that when we first sent in the master for Bloody Iris at the time for encoding, that our encoder author, he basically came up to us and like, yeah, that's not an issue.
Yeah. Yeah, I really have to give kudos to Ryan Macciola here because he's the one who's encoding our transfers and all that. He puts so much work into that and so much effort. And he is one of these people where, how should I say this? I would make a suggestion. And at first he's like, oh, I don't know if we can do that. But then half an hour later, he will call you. I did it, that sort of thing. It's like, because you got me interested, you piqued my curiosity there. I wanted to see if I can do it. And then he comes back, he's like, I did it and all that. And he's just like us. He's really concerned about the integrity of the encoding to make sure the grain remains the way it is supposed to and is not infected by blocking and all sorts of stuff. And we couldn't be happier.
Yeah. Yeah, that's what I've learned too is that the studios often, maybe always, with their restorations will completely remove the grain as you using those tools, and then they'll put it back artificially later. And I don't even know what to think about that. I don't know if that's good. I don't know if that's bad, but I just know that it's not the film at that point. You've taken what made it film out.
Yeah, because once you apply the DEVNR, like I said before, it doesn't look like the film anymore.
Yeah.
You can put grain back in, but you start with a source that is not the film anymore. So the end result cannot look like the film. It's just a physical impossibility. So the better approach typically for us is, if we want to maintain the integrity, is to not touch it at all and deal with it on the encoding end instead.
So it's been about a year since we talked the last time. I think it was June of last year. What has that year looked like for you? When we talked last, you were just launching the label, and these things were just that title. The first title was just starting to Case of the Bloody Irish is just starting to get picked up and reviewed by people. What's the last year looked like?
A lot of pixel peaking in frame restoration. Short Night was such an interesting beast in terms of restoration because although Bloody Iris had this distinct blotching issue where there were some scenes where it's like no matter how many times you clean it, it feels like that there's a certain level of blotching that just kept showing up or so. But Short Night had a similar but different issue where it felt like you will go over a shot and you say, okay, now it's good, it's clean. And we'll do another QC pass, like an internal one. And suddenly I'm pointing out like 5 different blotches in a corner, and we were looking at this. It's like, how did this slip by? And that was consistently something that kept happening with Short Night. And it drove us insane at one point because it was the sort of thing where it was like we felt like we were kept having to get stuff cleaned over and over and over again. And stabilization in that movie was such a nightmare for some reason.
I mean, there. I mean, Bloody Iris and Short Night were very different beasts from a technical level because Bloody Iris is very deteriorated. So it had a completely different kind of damage than Short Night did. So we came in with what we had learned on Bloody Iris and started working on Short Night, and suddenly you're like, I don't have these issues anymore because this film doesn't exhibit that. But you're not quite yet familiar with what other issues this or challenges this particular movie presents. And that's what happened, that once in a while you look at it and you make an internal review and you're like, oh, I didn't even pay attention to that. And all of a sudden you see, oh, there is this kind of damage and all that. And then it's like, okay, I have to go back and have to redo part of it and all that. But to go back to your original question, how did our year look like? I mean, when I talked to you last, you were actually one of the very first interviews we did right after the release of Bloody Iris. And at that point, we didn't quite know yet how is this going to shake out? How is this going to work? How will people perceive it in the long run and all that? And for us, it was extremely gratifying to see the kind of feedback we got and the kind of response we got because, I mean, people were so happy with the release. Sales were much better than we had projected initially and that we had anticipated. We already had to do a second print run a couple of months after the initial release and all. So it was all really, really nice. And it was a big learning experience for us as well. There were little hiccups with the shipping, with the packaging. When we initially shipped in the bubble mailers and people started complaining, it's like, no, we're getting these damaged lobby cards or damaged slip covers and all that. So we learned from all that. And it was an experience for us as well. And we adapted. We tried to listen. We went out there every day on social media and the forums to see what are people saying and adapted our workflow and our chain, how we do stuff. And went from there. And then, we were looking for the next movies. And you may remember that we were initially announcing to have Black Belly of the Tarantula next. And that changed. And that was an interesting story all in its own. I mean, just to give you the quick gist of it, is we had a restoration of the film already. And we were working on it. And the more we worked on it, we were like, this is not it. This is not the kind of product we want to put out. So we desperately tried to go back to the original rights holders and so forth to get permission to get access to the original camera negative. And it took a while, and eventually we got access to it. We got a brand new transfer then, and now we decided we will do the restoration from scratch again ourselves. And of course, that means a lot of work. And we said, okay, we have to, and especially because this whole process took a long time while we were waiting for responses and all that, we said, okay, let's go to Short Night and work on that. And then, when everything fell into place, we were so far into Short Night that we said, okay, let's continue this. We're not interrupting this workflow. We do Short Night first, and then we go to Black Belly of the Tarantula.
Let's talk a little bit about the what went into this as far as the special features. We don't have to go like, feature by feature, but there's hours and hours of things here, and we also have to. Everybody can see them over your shoulder there, but these beautiful lobby card reproductions like full, but it's 12 inches by 8 inches is what I think they are, right? Um, this is an incredible package. And by the way, this is for sale right now at the Celluloid Dreams website, which is linked in the description of this episode. But this is a more filled out package than the last release was. That release was already huge, but this is even bigger. Talk to me a little bit about curating these features for this release.
Okay, it started as a 2-disc release. When we started working on this project, we was like, okay, it's going to be like Bloody Iris, 2 discs, a couple of bonus features, slipcover, done. And then things happened. We started investigating more and researching the film more, looking at other releases that were before us, and we realized there is a slew of bonus features out there that for some reason or another have never really been used here in the US. Because there were releases in Germany, in France, all over the world, and many of them had their own unique set of bonus features. So we tried to cull from that and said, okay, let's see if we can get access to some of these features so we can reuse that. And we did, a good portion of it. And at that point, we were like, okay, let's make it a 3-disc release. Okay, cool. We started working on it, and then we started soliciting new material because we said we don't want to rely entirely on old, and rehash old featurettes and all that. We want some new content as well. So what can we do? So we solicited new material and all, and found material in the lab with like the catalepsis trailer where we were like unexpected confronted with it and say, hey, this is cool. We need to put that on the disc. And then Lucas was actually able to dig up a 35mm print of the film from the lab.
Because you're the 35mm fan.
Yeah, because the idea with Short Night, or actually in general for any of these projects or so, my goal or hope is always to be able to try and see if there's some sort of color-timed element. Because, with the original camera negative, it is whatever they shot on set that day. But the thing that always gave a film print their look when in a theater and all that was the timing stage. So sometimes they could shoot something like really warm or neutral or whatever, and then they would shift it to whatever color balance they wanted or needed. And so I really, really wanted to get a hold of an element that had that baked in. And yeah, so the lab suddenly, when we were inquiring about it, the lab hit us back saying that they did have a positive print. They didn't really provide much more info outside of that. The best I can garner was it was some 80s or 90s restrike of the movie. I wish it was a Technicolor dye print, but, it is what it is. Maybe one day someone in Rome will pull out a copy and say, we're doing this 1 anniversary screening in 2050.
Yeah.
Or however long that print will survive. Who knows? And so that was an interesting experience to be able to get a hold of and cross-reference with the negative, because in the commentary or the interview that Audolato did in the past release, he described very specifically that when they shot the movie, they shot it, quote, in the middle. And basically what this referred to was that they shot it in such a way where in post they would be able to make the exposure changes as flexible as possible. They made it so they can pull it down if needed, they can push it up if needed. They didn't shoot it on one extreme end or anything like that.
Let me interject here. Sorry. Let me interject here real quick. I think it's important to understand that a camera negative is usually not the same as what you see when you go to the theater and watch the movie. The camera negative is oftentimes very neutral in color and exposure. It's exposed so that the filmmakers can later go to the lab and say, we need to make this blue or we need to make this darker and so forth, so that there's as much headroom as possible so that they can really shift the levels of different colors and contrast and brightnesses and all that. So if you just were to make a straight transfer of the original negative and put that out, it would be so boring because it looks really nothing like the film is supposed to look.
And not even boring, sometimes just outright wrong, because you have instances in movies where suddenly there's like, in one version they had a day for night thing, and then suddenly in this one it's all warm or whatnot or whatever. Again, it's
and you know what? If you ever see a restoration that's been done from someone that didn't, sometimes I'll see movies that have day for night scenes and they haven't carried that over. Billy the Kid versus Dracula, as I think the name of the movie. It's a John Carradine vampire. Anyway, there's a scene where he's like, "What are you doing out here at this time of night?" And it's like broad daylight, and it's because when they restored it, they didn't do the day for night.
Exactly. So the challenge is always on his end to figure out what is the film supposed to look like, and an existing 35 millimeter print helps tremendously. You know,
there's still some challenges involving that, because with the 35 millimeter print, there's still an element of what I would humorously coin as photochemical roulette, where because of the fact where if you look up anything about any lab technicians who worked in the day, they will say, I don't like prints because sometimes they will come off too bright, too dark, too red, or whatever, etc. And the thing is, that was because when they worked on it, they had a specific aim in mind. And then usually whenever it actually does get struck, it usually has a skew to some degree because of chemical work and whatnot. So that posed an issue when working with a release print, because it had several generations off, so that's a few generations askew, as well as the fact that contrast sometimes differed or so. So it was kind of tricky to try and figure out what exactly is the measurable mid-tone that I need to look for. And in the case of Short Night, I did have to change it a little bit in the global balance, because the original print, and you can see it in the Grindhouse Master if anyone watches that, it's fairly magenta forward, not in a faded kind of way. It's more like you could tell this probably had a few points too few in the green territory. So it's why our transfer looks a bit more green than the printed. But at the same time, it did bring most of the movie back into a more normal territory, because there were some instances where you're looking at this and it's like, this cannot be right. You're watching like this party scene and it's like everything looks like it's red, and it's like, no, you understand what they try to do. They try to warm it up, but it's like it just looks weird.
Because all the lab work that is being done to these to these transfers and all that, it's an analog process. And there are so many factors that affect the outcome. Temperature of the chemical, for example, if there's any stray light, this, that, the film stock, and so forth. So, like he said, it's almost like roulette. You can tell a lab to make 3 strikes from a negative, and you will get 3 completely different results because of these variables and these tolerances that are built into that whole flow.
And we even have physical proof of that in a way, because when we struck the trailer, like the contact positive for the trailer, because we wanted to do the film strip thing for viewers or for buyers, we had 3 different copies of the trailer made from the negative. And, to my knowledge, they weren't properly timed, because it was just a contact from the negative. But every time you would look at a certain shot between each of the 3 reels that they gave us, one was yellower, one was greener, if I remember right, and one was reddish. So, it's that sort of thing where you're watching in front of your very eyes, where it's like, oh, so that's the skew they're talking about. So that's why generally when people do talk about the ideal scenario for trying to get the original color timing, it would be something like the interpositive, because that's the step from the camera negative to it being timed. But that hasn't come up yet for us with any of the movies, unfortunately.
You did mention this. Let's talk about this. Now, this will be on the audio podcast feed too. I'm holding up this strip of film. Where this is not real film. You didn't cut up a negative for this, or a print?
This is not a negative, no. I mean, well, it is real film, but it is
film. Okay.
Negative. It is struck on what I believe should be Kodak 2383, which is a modern film positive. It is struck from the negative in the sense where, they took the camera negative, they exposed the positive stock, and what?
No, nothing. So technical and all that.
Sorry, I don't know what level of technicality that people want to know.
Basically, we had it done specifically for that purpose. We didn't take an existing trailer and chopped it
Yeah,
up and all that.
that
We were very conscientious about that.
yeah, that's where I would draw a line.
Yeah.
Where it's like I'm not going to do that. That enters a certain level of unethicality
Yeah,
because then you're destroying a vintage material, and that I do not believe.
We
in
went to the
whatsoever.
lab and said, "Can you make 3 strikes for us of that trailer and send it over?"
That's what I wanted to know. Yeah. Are you guys collecting film? Do you have a film archive in your house? Like,
He doesn't.
Beginning to.
He looks at me and with that look of like, why are you doing this? And the funniest thing is I can do it. I have a small handful of trailers on my own accord. So I have, for like these Tuscan cans or so. So I have, for instance, like a trailer of the Presidio here. I know I have a scope trailer of Heat, a couple other things or so. And admittedly, it's a little unorthodox because, I don't really have a projector set up to watch it, but I have a friend of mine in Philadelphia who works as an archivist. And I send these to him, and he's able to get them telescene for me, or not telescene, but scanned for me. And so I'm able to have these encoded scans of the trailers or so from it. And they were all color calibrated and all that. And so they should look mostly like how they would if you were to project it. Obviously not one-to-one exact because so many different variables and factors involved, but it's as good as it can get without having the giant clunker of, an actual projector somewhere.
well, that's what I wanted to know because there are film fans out there, film collectors. There's this documentary about it that I saw last year called Film is Dead, Long Live Film. And it's about 35 millimeter and 16 millimeter film collectors. And their houses are just like archives of canisters. I mean, you can imagine the space that takes up. And if you have a projector for that, I mean, well, my friend Toby Rohn, 50 Westerns from the 50s, the website, he grew up, his dad like traded in movies, and he grew up like with a 35 millimeter projector in like the garage, and he'd bring his friends over and they'd watch Moonraker or whatever projected at his house. So you never know what they're actually watching in their houses. So I had to ask.
That sounds like a wonderful time though, if you have that.
Yeah.
Because I cannot stress enough that there's so many movies out there where you watch the home video version of it, and while you are watching the movie, there's so many things about a print that has that look to it, and even just a feel to it almost. It's like it's such a specific complaint in a way, but it's one that I argue cannot even be replaced even by really well done restorations or so, because there's really nothing quite like watching something like Dario Argento's Opera in a theater, and you get to watch that whole peephole scene with the oversized bullet in slow motion on projection and all that in a theater crowd. It's nothing quite like it. It's wonderful, and I wish that the print is more accessible, because obviously, we're kind of in this era now where it's all digital projections, and maybe the handful of IMAX stuff around because Christopher Nolan decides, hey, I'm going to make most of my movie IMAX, and then proceeds to tank said IMAX projectors because his movies are too long.
But that reminds me also, speaking of the experience in a movie theater, I mean, that's also one of the reasons why, for example, we've been showing Bloody Iris and Short Night in theatrical screenings. So in January, as part of January Giallo, for example, in Santa Ana in California, we had a screening of both movies back to back and all that at one of the art house theaters. And it was great, and people loved it, and it was, for us, it was awesome too, to get to see that movie on the big screen, It was our restoration, so it wasn't a 35 millimeter print, but still, these films that we've been working on for so long and all that, then to sit in the audience and see this projected on the big screen is like, wow, this is quite something.
I'm glad you said that because, of course, this is wonderful, and we do love all the work you put into these to make them wonderful home media releases. It's exceptional. But these movies are meant to be seen with a group of people in a movie theater, right? I mean, there's something magical about that experience. And I observe when I talk about, I talk so much about discs and physical media, that seems to be dying, the desire to see something with a group of people. But when you do see something with a group of people, there is a magic, there's like an alchemy that you can't describe that happens when you do that.
Okay, I'm going to go a little bit off tangent now.
Okay.
I'm going to talk about beer movies.
About what?
Beer movies. Here's, I want to say, I don't know, a little known fact. We've been talking about that a lot. It's like, why are films like Gialli and many of the Italian movies or European movies so different from Hollywood movies? And the reason for that is that many of them were designed as beer movies. The movie-going experience in Italy or in Europe during the 70s was very different than here. And I remember that from my childhood back in Germany. Instead of going to a movie theater, many times you would have some ballroom somewhere where a film is projected. And as part of the experience, there would be drinks, beer, and all that. So people would go there and watch the movie, but only half-eyed, because your other eye is talking to people and all that, and you're not constantly completely focused on the film. So as a filmmaker, the directors responded to that because they knew that is how many people see these films in rural areas where you don't have the megaplexes and all that, you know. So they are distracted, they don't always pay attention, they don't follow the plot necessarily. And that's one of the reasons why many of these films have these really thin plots sometimes, but also that is, for example, why, let's say, just as an example, Lucio Fulci's movies, let's say Zombie with the eye-piercing scene. This is very deliberate to grab people's attention. They're in the middle of a conversation, and then comes that, and then everybody stares at the screen. And that's why they created these really intense moments and highlights, these syncopes, very deliberately in their films. And if you pay attention, many movies, especially Italian movies, from the era, from the 70s, and maybe even before that and all that, are designed like that. They have this flow, and then pong, comes something really heavy hitting, and then it sort of ebbs and it comes again and on. And it's a very different structure than Hollywood, where in Hollywood this is all following a 3-act structure very rigorously, and it's all formulaic almost. And oftentimes the stories are so complex and the characters are so complex that you really have to stay with it to get the whole gist of it. And in many of these Italian movies, that's not the case. They weren't designed that way. And that's what makes them oftentimes a little foreign to us. When you watch them, it's like, this is a weird movie. It's like, no, it's not weird. It's just been designed for a completely different type of audience.
What's interesting about that it made me think of is that there's this discussion now about Netflix movies, or not even Netflix movies, but movies are made now they assume you're on your phone, and they'll pace it. There'll be quiet dialogue, and then things get loud to get your attention. And it's because they know you're not paying attention, and they have to get you. And we complain about this now, but it sounds like this has been around for
Around
many,
for a
many
long time.
years. Yeah. What a great insight. That's I'm glad you took us there. Okay, so we've got a 4-disc set now, right? You've got various versions of the movie. You've got all these special features. Is this the direct? What's the next one going to look like? Are you going to keep this up, or is it going to have to scale back down a little bit?
Well, Short Night was definitely, a very specific case where there were so many interviews with Aldo himself and whatnot that I genuinely cannot think of any other movie off the top of my head right now that remotely had the same level of extras made with the original people. So many of them are, maybe 1 or 2 with like a cast member or something like that. But very rarely did you have one where you had quite literally like 5 different interviews of the director, especially since one thing that wasn't mentioned earlier. One of the funniest things when we were trying to get extras for the Short Night release, one thing that came in at the 11th hour was shortly after we announced our release, and shortly after 88 announced their release or so, randomly out of the blue, a company came up to us and said, hey, so we have this one interview that we did in 2018 with him. do you like, we can sell this to
Yeah,
you.
would you like that for your release?
And we were like,
let's take a look.
And it was actually two things. One was like a Q&A at a theater, and unfortunately the audio on that was so distorted that we could not figure out all what he was supposed to be saying. And with the time that we had, it's like we just can't keep it on this release. But it was a little bit of a shame because it would be interesting to know what it was being discussed. But yeah, but the other
Well,
one.
I have a quick. Can I follow up that up with a question? Because I've seen. Okay, I just talked to another film restoration person, J.S. Wingfield, who worked on a documentary about a Goofy movie, and in that documentary they took vintage, it's like VHS footage that you couldn't really hear people in the distant background, and they were able to use this technology, new technology, to boost that and bring it forward. Is that something that you know about or that you're playing around? It might even be AI, and I know that's a dirty word.
I mean, AI is such a touchy thing because it really depends on the use case, where
It's
sometimes,
the intention.
like, yeah, where it's like,
Yeah.
okay, that's fine, and it's not like this one's like the no, 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 and it's a can of worms. But the main thing is, we did consider it. We did look at a couple of the plugins we had, but the main thing was, again, the movie was released already. We had a date already. So it's the kind of thing where, like, maybe if we had more time, we probably could have tested some stuff to see, but we really just couldn't do it within the.
So you're saying re-release, right?
Yeah.
No, I'm just kidding. I'm just
There are tools available these days that can do literal magic. Sometimes you wouldn't believe what comes out of it. It's like, this is just amazing. But yeah, even though they can do that, it's not like a one-button solution typically. It takes a lot of work to tweak everything all the time. And many times you have to write it as it goes because the quality changes and all that. So you can't just let it, put it on autopilot and say, do it, and you get a pristine result. That's not how these work. It takes a lot of time. And that's why with the Q&A session that we had, we were like, there's just no time doing that kind of cleanup right now because this was completely unscheduled and all. And no, we had our deadline. It's like, we can't do it. But the interview itself was of decent quality, except for a couple of microphone bumps, that we said, okay, let's take it. We can run with this. But Short Night is one of the few movies, I have to say, where there were so many extras or so many interviews and so much material available that we almost had to turn stuff down, because we couldn't fit it and because it became so repetitive. And I think that was one of probably the biggest challenges overall. Find stuff that reveals more insight and new insight, because having Aldo Lado retell the same story about his housekeeper giving him money and all that to make a movie, having it 3 or 4 times in different featurettes on the same disc is not the best use of space.
Redundant, right?
And that was, for me, for example, it was also one of the biggest challenges when I was doing my commentary track. It's like, because we have so much material, everything has been covered. I mean, I was sitting there, what else can I say? And it's only then when you start, okay, there's a little more to this story. There's a little bit there. So every once in a while, I will hit on some of the points that other people had mentioned in the featurettes and all that. But I extrapolate on it and go further and say, yeah, and this was the result, or this is why this happened, and this came out of it, without retelling the whole story again. I'm just saying, yeah, this happened. Here is what came of it and all.
It becomes also very amusing to be able to see also how there are some specific things that Aldo Lado might describe that he wanted to do but couldn't or didn't do. But then if you start, pulling away and you start looking at his career as a whole, you start seeing where he could see certain ideas being reused or shelved until a different project. Because one thing that that stuck out when we were discussing the commentary and we were spitballing, like, what could be talked about, one thing that came up was there was the train scene. The train scene, where it was like, the nutshell was, the original story was he wanted to have this foggy murder in a plaza square. It was like a whole plaza. They wanted it completely covered in fog. But then he saw, there was a train passing by at a nearby railway, and he thought that made it for a cooler murder scene. So the plaza murder got shelved. And then it becomes especially kind of funny when you look at, who saw her die, and then suddenly you're watching this whole cat and mouse scene completely shrouded in fog, and you kind of wonder yourself, where it's like, is this the idea coming back again,
Yeah.
or is it just like an image that he likes, or so? I don't know. I mean,
I found that fascinating because the more you listen to Aldo Lado, the more you realize how much of an anarchist he was, you know, as a filmmaker, and a little rebel and all that. You know, it's like he was pushing all the wrong buttons with people many times and all that, just because he wanted to do stuff and all that. And that scene with that train, that moment, that was, in my mind, it is so iconic because it represents who he is. And I don't know if you saw that or if you heard that story when he tells it in the commentary.
Do
It's
you want
like,
to tell it right now?
okay, so the script, he had the script, and the script called for Plaza. In his mind, it was St. Mark's Square in Venice. But because the location was completely different, he just said, okay, we'll need a square, we'll fill it with fog, we have this murder and all that. And then when he saw the train, he's like, oh, that is so cool, these billowing clouds and all that, that makes it even cooler. Let's do that. And then his producer said, like, no, 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 that was not in the script. This is not how we do that. You can't just change this around. He's like, come on, let's do this. It'll be awesome. And it's like, no, we stick to what was planned because that's what's budgeted. This is this is that. And Lado got really frustrated because he really wanted to do it with a train. So what he did was he went out location scouting and found the largest square in all of Zagreb, took his producers there and said, okay, see if you can find enough fog machines to fill that entire square with fog, because this is where I'm going to shoot this. And the producer was like, oh my God, you're killing me. Here's your train. You know? So that's how he got the train scene. You know? And his career is full of moments like that, where he's playing these, I shouldn't say playing, but where he's really using these tactics to manipulate people into doing things his way. And
yeah,
he's very anti-authoritarian.
He's a character. I mean, and
yeah. And it's like even right up to the last interview, like the 2018 one, all that. It's like you could tell in the way he talks about the past or so with some of those stories, like that's just him. He's he's one of those directors who very much was not a fan of being shackled.
Yeah, and speaking of the wealth of bonus features and all that, there was another bonus feature that was planned, but unfortunately didn't come together because Mario Mora, the editor of the film, actually passed while we were working on the project. We had an interview scheduled with him, and then he got sick a couple of days before the interview was actually supposed to happen, and he never recovered after that. And it's too bad, and that's one of the problems, because you ask, will we have stuff like that on future releases? We're running out of time, really. This is a race against time because many of these people are, unfortunately, we're losing them, and once they're gone, you can't get their recollections anymore, except for what is there already. So I think it's really important to archive what is there as well. And that goes for the featurettes, for the interviews and all that, as much as for the films themselves. And that is part of the reason why we put that VHS version, that pan and scan version, on the release as well. Because, I mean, I don't expect people to really watch this, It's like, yeah, you look into it real quick just to get a glimpse and say, hey, what did this look like and all that. But from our standpoint, it was much more important to save it, to create a digital version of it that can survive. Because this VHS version is virtually impossible to find. I mean, it took us months, and only then by sheer accident we found that VHS version. Was like, we have to grab this while we can, because it's really rare, and there are movies out there, where these probably don't even exist anymore. But it's a very important part in the history of the film, because with Paralyzed, with our VHS version, this is how the movie was initially introduced to American audiences. There was no theatrical run, nothing. The first time American audiences saw Short Night of Glass Dolls was on that VHS. And it was a very different experience than what we give you now.
That's wonderful. Yeah, we should mention, and we kind of have, but there's the VHS version, there's the Grindhouse version, and then the 4K restoration, which you've got on both 4K and the Blu-ray too. It's the history of the film in one box with the film itself, the context of the film, all of the legacy of the film, and then even let's talk a little bit more about these, because even including these lobby cards, which is huge, and it's website exclusive, right? That's the only way to get these,
Yeah,
right?
yeah.
This is preservation too, by sending these, by reprinting these and putting them back out into circulation. It's saving the lobby cards, and they're beautiful and they're immaculate. So do you want to talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, it's also one of those things. Sometimes they're really hard to find, and when you find them on auctions and all that, they can be very expensive. So yeah, you get them, you buy them, and then you get them, and they're all bent and torn, and they have fold marks and ripples and everything. And yeah, it's just like a movie, we go over them and we restore them. We clean them up, restore them, and then print them. And like you say, it's part of preserving the legacy of the film, because there will be a time when none of these lobby cards or these posters and all that are around anymore, because they're lost, they're deteriorated, they're yellow, they're have water damage, God knows what, I mean, they tear so easily too, because many of these photobuste and all that, they're printed on really thin paper, because they were throwaway articles for the theaters. They were supposed to be plastered on the wall once, taken down and tossed away in the trash. It's not like this is a real high quality poster or anything. It's really cheap paper. It's almost like newspaper paper, so yeah, they don't survive long unless they're properly archived and all that. And I think, or we thought, when we first came up with the idea for Bloody Iris, it was like, wouldn't it be cool if people really have the lobby cards and have them in a size that you can really appreciate them instead of the little postcard thing? Because yeah, these photobusti are enormous. They're really big posters.
Like, we can't really pull it out, but we do. Oh,
yeah, it's all the way back there.
Okay,
but they're really big posters.
Yeah, they're.
Well, how big are you? I know you can't pull them out, but like, how big are they? Are they like a couple of feet big?
When you think of photo booster or a lobby card or so, in your brain you're thinking of they're being like really small, because of course you keep seeing them in like a Blu-ray case, because that's what half these companies do nowadays.
Right.
But then you're suddenly confronted with one that is basically the size of you. Like the size of a person, and it's like, oh, now it makes sense. Because again, where it's like, yeah, if you put it up on a theater wall, it's like, yeah, it makes sense. It's a giant display. But so even these ones that we have, they're bigger than the other ones that other companies have, but they're still small.
Yeah, I mean, and depending on the movie and the production, they're different sizes. It's not a uniform size. The ones for Short Night, I believe, were 17 by 24 inches, which makes them about twice as wide as our reprint and twice as tall, if I remember right. Something like that. And those are small. The ones for Bloody Iris were larger.
That's crazy.
But but you have to think about it. What's their use? Yeah, they go into these glass cases, outside the theater, pinned up. They're supposed to attract people from across the street or across the plaza or whatnot. Yeah, they have to be big, It's just that in home video, we've so gotten used to these tiny little postcards, that you think, hey, this is what they were, lobby cards. Oh, they probably had them stacked on the desk in the lobby or so people can grab them. That's how you think of them potentially. It's like, no, that's not what they were. They were real posters.
That's crazy. Wow.
And we didn't like, for example, we thought, should we reproduce the original size? But we didn't like the idea of folding them. I think that's like an abomination. Unfortunately, posters are folded so often these days. It's like, even the original photobuste, when they were shipped to the theaters, were folded. And it's like, I don't know, here you print these gorgeous pieces of art, and then you destroy it completely by folding them and making crease marks and all sorts of things. It's a shame, That's why we said we put them on cardboard so nobody even thinks about folding them.
No, and even though in the context of this conversation, these sound small now, but they're not small. These are certainly bigger than anything you're getting from any other label. So I don't know. I think these are great. Thank you for doing that. We can start to wind down. Is there anything else that you want to talk about? Any area that we need to go into that we haven't covered yet?
I mean, I guess this would go for anyone who's just watching this but doesn't own a copy or will get a copy of Short Night. If you're going to watch the UHD, watch it in a black room. Do not watch it with the lights on whatsoever, because otherwise it will look too dark and you will not be able to see anything.
Are
And
you getting complaints about that?
I've been seeing floating around where, because of the way tone mapping algorithms work and all that, sometimes it will end up crushing the blacks in a really weird way. And I cannot stress enough where it's like, that's not actually what it should look like. If you watch it in a pitch black room, you'll see the shadows perfectly fine, as well as the highlights being all bright and whatnot. I don't know if that's, it was part of a sort of thing where I wanted to create a really subtler HDR look with this one. I'm not sure if it will be the same with Black Belly the Tarantula, because depending on how licensing and other things I'll have to research into, I definitely have to look more into Dolby Vision maybe, possibly down the line. But, no guarantees on that right now. But it's HDR is a very weird beast, for lack of better words. It's no one can agree on standards. Half the people are kind of saying where it's like it's an inefficient thing at its core, because because there's a wonderful gearhead video, I would like to say, by cinematographer Stephen Yedlin. If you know him, he shot most of the Rian Johnson movies that you see, like Knives Out and whatnot. And there's a whole 2-hour video of him essentially dissecting the concepts of HDR and basically the main flaws of it, where, again, you have multiple people who cannot agree on what HDR is supposed to represent, as well as the fact that, you have this format that can go to 10,000 nits, and the brightest that most TVs can go are like maybe 2,000 to 4,000. On top of that, it's like, why would you want it at 10,000? Other inefficiencies, including encoding, all sorts of like really hyper-specific tech stuff. So it's one of those things where I would definitely have to do more research into. But yeah, so I just at least wanted to get it out there where it's like, if you're going to watch this UHD in particular, pitch black room.
Just a quick word, because some people mention, our transfer is so dark of the film. I just want to put that thought in people's minds. Aldo Lado went to great lengths to create a movie that has a really gloomy and dreary atmosphere. And he wanted the visuals to represent that too. Short Night of Glass Dolls was never meant to be this super highlight bright film. It is gloomy. The whole atmosphere, the whole package is this oppressive and, I don't know, what, desolate almost, experience. And that's what he wanted to capture. And that's why the film looks much darker than many people would probably have expected.
And it's especially when you see the negative or so, you understand it much more clearly, because there's a handful of scenes, I would say, that did get pushed up in terms of brightness, where, it had to be overexposed or so on the color timing level. And those were essentially all of the lavish scenes. Those are the scenes where it's that party that Barbara Bach visits with, Jean Sorel and all that, where you have all the crowds of people and the warm lighting. I was like, that's probably one of the brighter parts of the movie. And you understand why, because that was the intent. It's supposed to be this quote-unquote warm, welcoming kind of vibe. Meanwhile, you go to this, gloomy library that's practically ancient in terms of structure. And it's like, it's one of those things where the movie lends itself to a very dark atmosphere.
And it was all very deliberate. Everything in that movie is so deliberate, once you really dig into it, in the details and all that. It's like, there is nothing left to chance in that film, which is remarkable because it was Aldo Lado's first his directorial debut. I mean, he had been assistant director on many other films before that, but this was his first solo flight. And he knew exactly what he was doing, and he knew exactly how to get it, and he knew exactly what he wanted. And I think that's really important to remember, because this was designed as a gloomy experience, as a, not a doomsday kind of thing, but just this,
oppressive.
Yeah.
Have you encountered people telling you what your transfer should have looked like? Is that a thing?
Not in so many words.
Yeah.
But the thing is, there are so many other versions of the film out there, all of which look so much brighter, including the 4K version that 88 Films released recently and all that. And of course, people draw comparison and draw conclusions from that and say, oh, you know, this is really dark. That's because we feel, and from our research, it's indicated this is what he wanted the film to look like.
I think it's also something that is something that you see a lot more with other movies where they had an even harsher contrast in comparison to the other releases. Because this one is more in terms of like, it's mainly darker is the big thing. But then if you look at something like Michael Mann's Thief, where that movie not only became gloomier, but also became completely, you know, tinted in a teal blue tone for the entire Criterion Master. So, and that is, you know, that sticks out like a sore thumb, and people obviously will say it was like, that's not intended and whatnot. And then you'll see people arguing saying, no, prints were blue as well. And, you know, all sorts of like debacles and whatnot.
You've seen the Heat 4K too, which is like orange now.
From everything that I understand, because of the way it was shot in the 90s and all that, I believe Heat was supposed to be this rather warm yellower tone, actually. I know someone who actually went to see it projected with Michael Mann in person. It was at like Banff, if I remember right. And I remember he told me it was a very warm looking movie because he went in with the mindset of like he wanted to keep notes or so, this sort of thing. Because the other thing is, if you look at the interview of Michael Mann when he talks about his newer restoration of that movie, he does openly say that he wanted to grade the movie as if it was a modern production, which is why it looks the way it does. And it's one of those things where I've seen this with a couple of movies and directors or so, where on one hand, I do hate knowing that the original look of a movie is buried, but I also I feel hard to disagree with the director making his own choices with his own movie. And, you know, I know another example of this sort of thing would be something like Chungking Express, where I know that looks very different from a theatrical release. But at the same time, if you have Wong Kar-wai saying, that's how I want the movie to look like, I don't know what I should say at a certain point. So I do believe that if there was like a beautiful answer would be to have two versions of a movie available, but that gets into a certain level of excess where I don't know what would realistically be a solution down the line.
To find the original look of the movie is hard, especially with these old movies, you know, when you can't talk to people and ask, you know, what was your intent? How did you envision this and all that? So when I say, you know, there are these bright versions and there's our version and we feel this is what the movie is supposed to look like, it doesn't necessarily mean, and I do not want to demean anybody else, it's like, it doesn't mean the other versions are necessarily wrong. It's just our interpretation of this film and how, from everything we figured and found, this is what we think is the look of the film.
All right. Well, do you think it'll be a year before the next release, or do you think it'll be a little quicker than that? I mean, no pressure. I'm just curious.
It's the two of us.
Yeah.
It's taking time.
And it's clearly a labor of love. I mean, this is what you do, you know, you put all this effort into it. So I had to ask.
I mean, I hope that we'll be able to get it out in some reasonable time. Especially since I know, you know, we already accidentally announced this and then pulled back on it already, so we don't want to keep people waiting for forever. But we also do want to take the time to make sure that this is coming out okay and all that. I will say there are some very exciting stuff involving that restoration. And in general, it's already been very interesting because of the nature of the restoration.
Yeah.
And that's the stuff that I assume we'll be talking down the line next time around. But it's already been kind of interesting, and we haven't been able to do that much headwork already, but you know, it's so much to dissect.
Well, when the time comes, will you come back and talk to me about it?
Absolutely.
I would love to.
All right, so the website, anything else you want to shout out? Anywhere else you want people to go and look for you or find, you know, social media, or I can link to all of that in the description of this episode.
Yeah, we're all over. Come see us on Blue Sky or Instagram, Facebook, or come to our website, yeah? There are nice order links and you get all the cool stuff with it. And you support us directly.
You support us directly.
Yeah.
You get a nice little film strip for Short Night and all sorts of other stuff. And yeah, maybe down the line we'll also try to see if we can.
And we love the
Put out
support.
other-
Yeah, we love the support that we're getting from people. It's really, really nice to see. We love that.
Maybe a short night mouse pad one day.
Maybe one day a short night mouse pad. Yeah, who knows?
But yeah, it's outside of that.
Yeah.
Well, thank you both for being here to talk to me about this. It's been great to catch up with you.
Thanks for having us on. We love to be there every time.